It's good to be here. I've been about 50 times to the States, but I've only got round to half the States, and this is my first time in Mississippi. And it's good to be here. I'm aware that the bubble of USM isn't Mississippi, but it's the most agreeable bubble imaginable. I'm thoroughly enjoying myself. My only objection is that it's rather a long way from London. It took me forever to get here yesterday. But I've been coming, as Jamila said, because I've been working in Washington, I've been coming about 10 times a year to the States, usually for a couple of days, but occasionally on trips, because my job involved visiting many places and inspecting museums and indeed giving talks in those museums, stealing ideas, that kind of thing. So I've covered a lot of territory over the years. I like it here. Now, I'm pleased to be here. I'm flattered that Jamila asked me to come. I wondered why me, but we've known each other a long time. And why this? I mean, Milton's Paradise Lost was published 350 years ago. It's still being taught and read. There's an academic Milton industry. It consists of about 1,000 people, including the two of us and several others in the room. And that industry mounts specialist journals. There are 2 of them published in this country, conferences all over the world. In recent years, we've met in Tokyo because Japan has many Milton specialists, all, as far as I know, Christians, which is very interesting. That's what attracts the Japanese. We met in London, wherever that is. Next year, there'll be a Milton Jamboree in Strasbourg. This university has long been a part of that global community, and a very visible part, thanks to the presence here of Jamila. And that's the reason why I'm pleased to be here. Now, what I want to talk about is why we've decided to annex this particular individual in our literary past to the present. I should perhaps add that not everybody thinks that the long dead are relevant. I'm thinking of Huck Finn's Bible lesson, for which I apologize for reading with an English accent. It doesn't go naturally, but he says, after supper, she got out her book and learned me about Moses and the bulrushers, and I was in a sweat to find out all about him, but by and by she let it out that Moses had been dead for a considerable long time. Then I didn't care no more about him, because I don't take any stock in dead people. Now, Huck speaks for many, but not for us. We still engage with Moses, who features in the opening lines of Paradise Lost as the shepherd who first taught the chosen seed, which he did, in Milton's view and that of modern evangelicals, by writing the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah. Now, Paradise Lost is biblical literature. And that raises the question of the extent to which we're able to engage with it. I live in a largely secular country. The Bible is unfamiliar to most people and to most of my students. I recall a tutorial some years ago, 5 people in it, I think, and I'd asked them to read the first 3 chapters of Genesis and book 9 of Paradise Lost, and when they came in the next week, I said, any questions before we kick off? And a young woman who'd been educated in a Northern Ireland convent school said, it's the same story in Genesis and Paradise Lost, book 9. That's right, said I. The same people, Adam and Eve in it. Yes, yes, said I. Tell me, she said, which was written first? And I thought it was a dreadful moment. And of course, it was dreadful because the other students, if they knew the answer, felt that their flank was exposed. And I somehow had to reassure this woman that it wasn't a terrible thing to be unaware of the gap. The other that strikes me is that on the shepherd who first taught the chosen seed is that the question of Moses came up with another group, And I said, who's prepared to tell me about Moses? And most of the students had never heard of Moses. But there was a Muslim woman sitting in the class, and she said, isn't he the same as Musa? And I said, yes. And so she told the little group who Moses was. So there's another angle of biblical literacy being refracted in the Quran. Now, beyond that, it's true publicly. Something like manna, every American knows what manna is. But I'm a ballet enthusiast, among other things. And when Carlos Acosta dances in England, he's simply described as the finest dancer in the world, which he is. I was in America a few years ago, and he was dancing in New York, and he was advertised as the manna from Havana. And you can only get away with that kind of pun in America, where everybody knows what manna is. And the other thing is, with a literature like Paradise Lost, that there's a difficulty that it's Christian belief. And the characters in the poem represent two of the central figures in Christian belief, the God the Father and God the Son. God the Holy Spirit doesn't make the cut in Milton. He did not believe in the Trinity. He argued that it hangs on a very narrow thread, which is the Great Commission of Jesus, go ye therefore, teaching them to, and baptizing in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And in the name, eistoonoma in Greek is singular rather than plural, and therefore there's a Trinity. And that's the only evidence. Milton didn't believe it for a second. The 3 in 1, 1 in 3, he just thought was nonsense. So there's complete silence on the Holy Spirit, which is capable of upsetting people. Now, the difficulty with this kind of subject that involves Christian belief is that we're all emotionally engaged with it. If we're talking about the gods of Homer and Virgil, it's not a problem. You simply explain who they are, and people know it or they don't know it. But there's no question of belief in them. Whereas with the Christian God, there's a real issue of belief. And I have students who are believers, who grasp the poem as their own, and I have students who emphatically aren't believers, who are the majority, and they regard it as bewilderingly foreign and full of superstition. So that's a problem. The second problem, just letting yourself a bit further into that, is that in the 17th century, as indeed some parts of the world, I've felt it in parts of America, I've felt it in parts of the Islamic world, God is simply a fact. God exists. There's no question about it. The modern choice that we have of belief or disbelief or unbelief was unavailable in Milton's England. The first atheist that I'm aware of is a French priest, oddly enough, in 1697, who wrote Deus non est, God does not exist, and he wrote it in his diary. That was the only person he ever told. He's the earliest recorded atheist. Agnosticism comes along in the 19th century with Huxley and so on. So in other words, we have choices about belief or disbelief or skepticism or ignorance that people in the 17th century didn't have. What the difference is that they had another alternative. If you take someone like Christopher Marlowe, Marlowe believed in the existence of the Christian God. He had no doubts about the existence of that God, but he disliked him intensely. And that is not a choice now. If a Christian says to you, I'm a Christian, I believe in God, and you say, what's your God like? They never say, well, good on a good day. In other words, there is... The whole religious perspective has absolutely shifted, and we're dealing with a kind of committed belief that is alien to the society in which we move. And that's very difficult to overcome. The third issue there is that the God that was worshipped in the 17th century was far more anthropomorphic than the God that is believed or not believed in now. He had hands and feet, he could turn his back. Ludwig Muggleton, the leveler, said that God was probably almost 6 feet high. And it's clear that he's thinking in terms of a God who simply looks like a human being. There is no one I've ever met now that takes that kind of view. So in other words, it's a different kind of God that cannot be annexed to the one we have now. And finally, the final point on this is that it's a society, the 17th century, with in which religion, Christian belief, is a filter through which you see everything else. Things that we see as secular aren't. Hamlet, for example. There was a doctrine around, it's gone out of fashion now, but there was a problem with the Annunciation. How did the Virgin Mary preserve her virginity and receive the seed of Jesus? And the answer was that the seed of Jesus entered through her ear. And it's called the conception of the Madonna through the ear. In medieval paintings, you often see the dove flying towards the ear, or a piece of paper with the appropriate verses from Matthew and Luke on it, headed for her ear. It's a most peculiar doctrine, but it was widespread. And if you watch Hamlet, you'll see there's the scene in which old Hamlet is poisoned. And how is he poisoned? He's poisoned by poison being poured into his left ear. We see that as entirely secular, but an audience watching then would see that as an act of blasphemy. It's a kind of parody of the conception of the Virgin. So it's a society that simply sees the world elsewhere. Now, there's also an issue of our use of the past. The purpose of much popular history, certainly, is to ratify and glorify the present. If you think about Magna Carta, Magna Carta is touted in England because we have this great institution called Parliament. And where did it come from? And you trace it all the way back to the 13th century, to 1215. And you say, Magna Carta, therefore Magna Carta is very important because it is the origin of Parliament. But the importance of Magna Carta in the 13th century is zero. It doesn't deserve a footnote in a book. In other words, it only becomes important in retrospect. And one of the things I'm trying to do is resist that kind of perspective that emphasizes elements that lead to the present. Sometimes that leads to readings of the past that are contested. If you think, for example, about the debate about the origins of America, those who think of America as a Christian country represent the founding fathers as early evangelicals. Those who see it as a country in which church and state are wholly separate represent the founding fathers as Enlightenment deists. And the two sides draw on different pieces of evidence. Evangelicals point to phrases like all men are created equal, created, and see an acknowledgement of the Christian view that we're all created by God. Secularists, on the other hand, quote Adams 2, not Adams 6, to the effect that the government of the United States is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. So you sort of pick your evidence in order to construct your view, a very dangerous procedure. So this is one of the topics that create a complicated relationship for us. There are many others for the relationship with Milton. Love, death, politics, political activism, suicide, sex, radicalization, exceptionalism. You'll be glad to know I'm not going to talk about all of them. We'd never get out of here. But I'll just pull a few examples out of the hat by way of leading us forward. Let me say, for those of you that are really interested in sex, the one thing you can say safely that will allow you to understand the relationship between now and then is that if you look at women who survive till the age of 12, which was a minority of women, the cause of death thereafter, women were most likely to die, not of plague or of old age or all the rest of it, but childbirth. It was the huge killer. So for women, any act of sexual congress was in fact a threat to life. And that leads to a whole different set of attitudes from attitudes that we might encounter now. It's not obvious when you read the literature, but once you know that, it explains an immense amount about it. But let me have a go at a couple of the others. Suicide, first of all. Milton wrote a book called Samson Agonistes, which is a version of the biblical story of Samson in the book of Judges. At the end, Samson pulls down the pillars. He's in the arena. He pulls down the pillars. The arena collapses. He kills all the Philistines. Great to kill lots of people. But the problem is he kills himself in the process. The killing of Philistines is not presented as an ethical problem because Milton had no problem with killing enemies. Cromwell repressed the Irish Rebellion of 1641 and killed 618,000 Catholics by famine or straightforward murder, including slitting the throats of prisoners of war. Milton called it a civilizing conquest. There are moments when we step aside from the horror of Milton. So there's no problem in his mind, there is in mine, with killing vast numbers of people, but the problem is that Samson, in the process, killed himself. Suicide. Suicide was illegal in England until 1961. Popular opinion was mixed. I don't know of anyone who watches Romeo and Juliet and says at the end, well, it's them off to hell because they've just killed themselves. But there were complicated issues discussed by Renaissance combatants in the culture wars of the time. John Donne is one of them. But was Socrates, for example, a suicide? Socrates was ordered by the court to go home and kill himself. And he went home, he took hemlock. I think his last words were, "My knees feel funny." And so was that a judicial execution or was that a suicide? But the real problem was Jesus. Jesus willingly gave himself. He sacrificed his life voluntarily. Was that suicide? And if so, is suicide legal? John Donne took the view that it was, that Jesus did commit suicide and that he was allowed to do so, and that was the basis of the atonement. Now, these are emotive issues. In my lifetime, we've had instances of soldiers who, when a hand grenade has been tossed into a foxhole, have fallen on the hand grenade to take the full force of it themselves and save their comrades. Do we condemn that? In the case of Milton's Samson, he's been compared to a suicide bomber, a martyr for his cause, and Miltonists debate this kind of thing. Now, I have no answers to any of this. These are complex questions, but the reason I'm mentioning it is that Milton's Samson resonates in debates that we have now. Those same ethical debates are there. And in reading Milton, we're forced to consider the same issues afresh. I'll give you another example, which is exceptionalism. You'll all be familiar with the American variety. If you think of, I don't know, John Winthrop declaring Puritan New England to be a city upon the hill, a model for the rest of the world. But as you all know, we in England ran the world before you did. And we had similar ideas. Milton, for example, thought that the Reformation could not have been started by Luther because Luther had the misfortune to be a foreigner. When God speaks, He speaks, as is his habit, explained Milton, first to his English. I bet you didn't know that. On this understanding, the true father of the Reformation wasn't Luther, because he can't have been, because he was foreign, but it was Wycliffe, who was an Englishman, who thereby becomes a sort of the first Protestant. It would have shocked Wycliffe to discover he was a Protestant. Now, such claims are endearingly batty, and I'm happy to laugh at them. But the problem is that they have a darker side, and they slowly evolve into the notion that white Anglo-Saxon Protestants are the chosen of God. WASPs on this reading enjoy a privilege that has divine authority. Now, assumptions like that have disfigured societies through the centuries, and in the 21st century, racism still remains a disfiguring element in both our societies. Now, third, and this is when I'm going to go through to Paradise Lost, is the subject of radicalization. We think of people as having fixed opinions throughout our lives, but it's not true. None of you will have the same opinions in 20 years that you do now. And you think of yourself as firm in your things, but in your views, but you're not. I mean, what I want to do is read an advertisement to you that was operating in my youth, and it's sponsored by Ronald Reagan, and it's for Pall Mall cigarettes. And I just think about this. When you want to turn on the ladies, this is in the voice of the cigarettes, when you want to turn on the ladies, we're there. If you want to look like a hot stud, count on us. Want to be the next president? Just do what Ronald Reagan does and smoke lots and lots of Pall Mall brand cigarettes. The sooner you start, the faster you'll rise to political success. Don't delay, try some today. Smoking isn't hazardous, it's fun, delicious, and cool. Now, it's hard to believe that deeply offensive sexist pack of lies, as I mildly regard it now, was an entirely acceptable advertisement in our youth, my youth. But the fact is that our attitudes change over the course of a lifetime and change radically. Now, in the popular imagination, Milton is a Puritan, a sort of early evangelical grump, but it's a very suspect view because our thinking does change. Sometimes it's a catastrophic event that changes it, you know, the death of a child, a catastrophic public event, that kind of thing. We can think of those who react to such an event by losing their faith. We can think of others who react to such an event by gaining a faith. I mean, it works both ways. In the case of Milton, I think a change did happen. Now, the changes that happen are normally gradual. But most of us move from being idealistic and left of center when we're 18, and by the time we get really old, say 40, then we start to think that young people don't have any manners and could use a haircut. Now that normal notion of moving to the right is, of course, challenged on all sorts of ways. Someone can become radicalized. If you think of the narratives we have about Islam, it's often about someone becoming radicalized. Within Christianity, there is a notion of being born again, a kind of radicalization there. That wasn't available to Milton, of course. The phrase born-again Christian first appears in Webster in the Oxford English Dictionary in 1961. It's not very old at all. in Milton's day, you couldn't be born again. No one would know what you're talking about. The only conversions were from other religions. You could convert from Catholicism, you could convert from Judaism, or you could convert from Islam. Indeed, as many did in the 17th century when they were captured by Barbary pirates. In short, that won't work, but we need something else. Now, the something else I'm after occurs in 1637. It's a very precise date. Before 1637, Milton was a certified sort of bells and smells royalist Anglican. He was familiar with the theatre. He was moved by stained glass. He loved organ music. Indeed, I found some years ago that his father was involved with the Blackfriars. I had a lead from someone who'd been studying in the Huntington, so I was in the National Archives in England, and I found it was a piece of vellum, the side of a calf. And this calf must have been slaughtered when it was quite old, because the skin was very wrinkly, and the writing was sort of hidden in the crevices. And you feel like if you're sitting in the National Archives, it's a bit like a goldfish bowl, but you have to wait for a moment when there's no curator looking. And in that case, I had a ruler with me, so I was able to, no one was looking, I could get the ruler and flatten out this thing and read what it was saying. And what it was saying was that Milton's father had become a trustee of the Blackfriars Playhouse. Yeah, so thank you. That means Milton grew up in a family with theatrical interests, and indeed his first publication was in the second folio of Shakespeare. So it's hardly a Puritan background. Now, the question is, what happened? What turned Milton? Is there a shelf in here? There is a shelf. And I want to tell you about two incidents in 1637 that you might not know about, that I think may have been the cause of Milton turning. The first was a public event. The Court of Star Chamber, which was the vehicle of the ceremonialist end of the Catholic Church, pronounced sentence on 3 Puritan radicals who had been convicted of sedition. They were middle class. William Prynne was a lawyer, and the others were an Anglican priest and a medical doctor. They were sentenced to mutilation. Their ears were cut off, and their noses were slit. Punishment was brutal, and they were branded. Milton was in London that day. I don't know if he attended, but it's entirely possible he attended. And it was one of those moments that turned huge numbers of people against the Anglican Church, because it was deeply oppressive. It was seen as a vehicle of authoritarianism, and it polarized the nation. Now, those kinds of things still happen. In 1964, 3 civil rights workers, Cheney, Goodman, Schwerner, I still remember the names, were murdered here in Mississippi, 120 miles north of here. It was a moment that changed my life absolutely, in which I realized the evils of segregation. And it polarized, and I wasn't living in America, but it polarized this country, and it polarized globally, that event. It led to Lyndon Johnson passing the Civil Rights Act. Now, we're talking about something similar in the 17th century, where you mutilate 3 upstanding citizens who had done absolutely nothing wrong. So, one possibility is that an event made Milton snap in a way that events can make all of us snap. I was 20 at the time. I still remember it. But also, things closer to your own life can make you snap. There was a visitation of the Laudian Church to the village where Milton was living. The village is right at the end of the first runway at Heathrow, so I suppose it was handy for the airport for him. It's a bit noisy now, but the visitor came and was insisting that the church be made to conform with the liturgical rules of Archbishop Laud. Families sat in family pews, rectangular pews, not in the kinds of pews that exist now, and you owned your own pew. And people became very attached to their pews. They had them for generations. And the visitor said, "Mr. Milton's pew is too high by 6 inches and must be cut down." Well, how would you feel about that? Well, maybe you wouldn't feel too badly, but the other thing he said was there are 2 burials in the aisle of the church that are back to front, and they must be reversed. One of those was Milton's mother, that he had buried 4 months before. So here is some twerp from the church saying that his mother has to be disinterred and turned the other way to satisfy some stupid liturgical requirement. Now, you can see that someone could easily be turned by that. I feel indignant even as I tell you the story. And that's the case. So I've given you one public possibility and one private one, and they might both be wrong, I don't know. But what we do have is a simple fact that in 1637, Milton became a Puritan, and that's the camp he joined. That was his view when he arrived many years later to write Paradise Lost. In the intervening years, he'd been a worker for the Puritan Revolution. When the king was decapitated, Charles I had his head cut off. Milton thought that was the best thing that ever happened. He was really keen on decapitation. Some people turned on by odd things, but anyhow. He was deeply keen on it. And he worked for the godly republic, as he saw it, until Charles II was restored in March 1660. Charles II was arguably the most immoral monarch in England's history, and there are some strong competitors there. James I is one of them. Anyway, I won't go down that. There are uncomfortable analogies with the present situation, but the problem Milton had was understanding why God would allow this kind of thing to happen. God's ways stood in need of justification, and it's the only time in English history when we can prove that huge numbers of English citizens wanted to hold God to account. Why had God let the godly republic collapse? Why had the country been put into the hands of an utterly immoral person? So one thing to think about Paradise Lost is that it is a poem about coming to terms with defeat, and what it is to lose and have no possible way ahead. I think I've just finished, have I? Well, no. Sorry about you. You could have got away 10 minutes early. Now, in the I want to think about how this affects the characters in the poem. Specifically, there's the overriding problem is why God allows these things to happen. Why does he allow the innocent to die in tsunamis and terrorist attacks and car accidents and drone attacks and diseases? The urge to make God explain himself is very strong in Milton. Now, how does it affect the poem? Well, I'll finish by talking about 3 of the characters, well, 4, because Adam and Eve are separate. But first, a few words about Satan, then a few words about God, and finally, Adam and Eve. First of all, Satan. Satan comes with a bad background. He's Things are satanic in the Arab world. The United States is sometimes referred to as the Great Satan. Indeed, I was on a slight diversion. I was on a Pakistani television program years ago when Mr. Bush 43, was president. And I did a 25-minute interview. And then there was a phone-in. Now, never agree to a phone-in because you can't see the questions coming. And there is a figure in Islam, al-Dajjal, who is roughly like Satan, a non-Quranic but figure. And somebody who rang in asked me if Mr. Bush was the Antichrist. And I thought, well, what's the correct answer? So I replied that I thought that one of the qualifications for being the Antichrist was high intelligence, so that I wasn't sure that Mr. Bush qualified. And I had a television studio, including a cameraman who was rolled over with laughter as it droned on, but the moment passed. Now, Milton was a Republican, of course, but his Satan is a monarchist. But he phrases it oddly. He's boasting, and since I in one night freed from servitude inglorious, well nigh half the angelic name, and thinner left the throng of his adorers. Now, from servitude inglorious, well nigh half the angelic name. It was in fact a third, but Satan being Satan, he always exaggerates, and a third is virtually half. But the notion of freed from servitude, conservatives, and I'm thinking in English terms, not in American terms, but conservatives think in terms of a hierarchy of society that is perfectly normal, and each of the categories sustains itself, and all is happy. People on the left of the political spectrum, if you think of Marx, thought in terms of hierarchy as a form of oppression, that each side enslaves or enchains the bits below them. Satan represents the hierarchy of heaven as servitude inglorious. Now, why would he do that? If Milton's a Republican, why represent Satan as a Republican? Well, the answer is that revolutions fail not because of invading armies. Charles II didn't come back with an army. Revolutions are betrayed from within by people who speak the language of revolution, but in fact are traitors because of their own ambitions. I've wondered about the analogy with Benedict Arnold on this. I mean, he fought with the colonists at Ticonderoga in 1775. The next year, he helped to block Britain at the Battle of Lake Champlain. The year after that, at Saratoga, he wasn't, in his view, honored for his military exploits, and so he turned traitor. Milton's Paradise Lost has Satan as a good angel, and then God decides he needs a deputy, and who does he decide to appoint? His son. And Satan sees this as a bit of nepotism. He feels passed over. He feels that God is ungrateful, and he turns into a traitor. There are parallels with the way these things go. Now, God is a sensitive character. He used to be portrayed on the stage, but God as a stage character was suppressed at the Reformation, and didn't appear again on a stage until, well, actually it was until 1930 when Mark Connolly's Green Pastures was first performed in New York City in a play that now is rightly regarded as racist. Now, Milton's God is never seen, but he is heard. Milton wouldn't portray God visually, not because he was blind, but because he was a Protestant. And Protestants, even now, if you go into a Catholic church, there'll be a cross with a body on it. But if you go into a Protestant church, there'll be a cross that is empty. Now, the problem with this is the characterization of God, and it's capable of offending. What happens is Milton, God the Father and God the Son are sitting in heaven, minding their own business, and suddenly Satan goes whizzing by to corrupt Adam and Eve. And God, the Father, is really annoyed. And he says, you know, he displeasure. He said, I'm going to zap the lot of them. I'm going to undo my creation. And he has a little rant. And at the end of it, he says, but for mercy first and last shall find us time. And the Son, who's cleverer than the Father, says, gracious was that word that closed thy sovereign sentence, and begins to talk the Father around, saying, destroying people, it would be very hard on your reputation. That would be far from thee to do that. Now, this is a very odd story, but I want you to think back to the early books of the Old Testament. Abraham with Lot. The God is annoyed with Sodom and Gomorrah. And God says he's going to destroy them, the cities. And Abraham says, wilt thou also destroy the righteous with the wicked? Peradventure there be 50 righteous within the city. Will you destroy the city and burn those 50 people? And the God says, well no. Whereupon Abraham says, well, 45? And the God says no. And it goes down to 40 and 30. And finally it gets down to 10, the God says, I will not destroy it for the 10's sake. And then he stops bargaining, and the Lord says the Lord went his way. Now this is not an omniscient, omnipotent God of a sort that appears in the Tanakh, in the Old Testament after the revelation, or the Reformation of Ezra, when the Israelites returned from Babylon. This is a much earlier God. I mean, there are other examples. The obvious one is perhaps Moses with the golden calf. And again, the God says, I'm going to destroy them. And Moses says, well, you brought them out of Egypt and you'll look foolish. And he goes on to persuade God that it wouldn't be good for his reputation. Now, to us, I think this seems insulting and demeaning to a God, the God that we think of in the 21st century. But in the 17th century, people like Milton took their characterization of God from the earliest books of the Old Testament. And that's how the God is presented in the earliest books. And indeed, that phrase, that be far from thee, Father, comes directly from those two accounts I've just been reading to you. So Milton has the same ones in mind. Now finally, and I'll finish with this, Adam and Eve. In the theological literature, including the one Milton wrote, Adam and Eve are bad. That's the end. They don't have any character. They did the wrong thing, and that was that. Or Eve did first, and followed by Adam. It's all her fault. It's a dreadful narrative, that's it. But if you turn to Paradise Lost, something extremely interesting happens. Which is that he endows Adam and Eve with characters, as if they were in a play. They become fleshed out human beings with motives and that kind of thing. And when it comes to the fall, he gives them reasons for falling. So in the case of Eden, the serpent, the snake comes along and says, "Ooh, you're beautiful," and she's well, and the serpent then says, "You've got this problem with knowledge. Your God wants to keep knowledge from you. It's not fair, is it?" And Eve says, "Well, I quite agree," and she's gradually persuaded to take the apple. Now that strikes me as entirely understandable. It's the wrong thing. But you understand absolutely why Eve does it. And then she goes back to Adam and says, by the way, I've fallen. And Adam's first thought is to divorce her, which I don't think is very generous, but anyway. And then she worries that, you know, there's going to be another Eve and that she'll be zapped. And Adam finally decides to fall with her because he loves her. It's a case of, you know, uxoriousness, it's called. He loves her too much. Now, I speak as one who's been married for 52 years. I don't think that's a bad thing to take that view, that there can be in love a kind of nobility. Now, the official answer is, it was wrong, you shouldn't put your wife before your God. I understand all of that. But when you're reading the poem, you suddenly realize that what Milton is doing is not only justifying the ways of God to man as best he can in the face of this horrible catastrophe, but he's doing the opposite at the same time. He's justifying the ways of man in disobeying God to God by saying, I know we disobeyed, but there are complicated reasons for this and there are motives for it, and I hope you'll give us an understanding. So, I began by saying there are all these points of contact, you know, the love, death, political activism, suicide, sexuality, radicalization, exceptionalism. I must have thought of a few others. And they occupy us now in Mississippi and in England. In studying Milton and Mississippi, we're seeing different perspectives on questions that we still engage with on a daily basis. We become sensitive to the continuities and discontinuities between Milton's time and our own, and that has to be a good thing. Okay, many thanks.